Welcome to this YouTube. My name is Rudolf Hertle. I'm a retired pastor and the son of Reverend Wilhelm Hertle and Hedwig Hertle. My parents were the first missionaries to enter the Wiro area, and I'm here to tell you the story. So, let's get along. When the Wiro area was opened in November 1960, the government had only lifted the restrictions of the northern part of the area. Southern Wiru was to be opened at a later date. When my parents arrived in Tiripini on the 8th of May 1961, they visited the site of the government station at the end of the airstrip. The whole place was muddy, and it was only until September 1961 that the round bush house of the government, here seen in the background, was completed, and the first Kiap, Mr. Brian O'Neill, moved in. Up to that time, the administration was in Yalibu. As I mentioned earlier, he was to be the father of the Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea, Honorable Peter O'Neill. Brian O'Neill had done a very good job in establishing the Pangaea station, opening the area and making the first patrols. Geoffrey Clark states that his intention was to turn the region into a showcase. He was now on the verge of moving on. Later he completed his career as magistrate at Goroka. After a few days he visited my parents and introduced his successor, Mr. Peter Barber, who was now to take over as a new Kiap. My parents had them for tea. On the 26th of November 1961, the two Kiaps had come back from a 4 weeks patrol of the Southern Wiru. They reported that they estimated the population to be about 6,000 to 7,000. The tribes lived in groups of about 500 to 800 members. The Kiaps believed the government would be opening the area at the beginning of 1962, but it actually took them until June when my father heard the announcement on radio news. He contacted Reverend Felix Döring to come to Tiripini and accompany him on a trip through the new area. It was the general procedure in those days to invite at least another experienced missionary when entering the new area. This gave them a chance to discuss things over when decisions had to be made. The Kiap drew up a map of the area showing my father the places he could visit. Early in the morning my father and Reverend Döring left Tiripini together with 6 evangelists and a group of carriers. One of the evangelists was Naaman, the son of the famous Yavim carver Davidi. The picture shows Naaman sitting beside my father. It was raining when they reached the first village after 3 hours' work. The people were busy preparing for a big pig killing and eating, which was part of the Timbu Cult. Some were in the forest collecting fern to be placed in a traditional earth oven, but the people spared a little time to welcome the guests. They offered them some sites to place the evangelist. The procedure called for good judgment and communication with the locals. The site had to be close enough to the village and yet have enough space to provide gardens for the family of the evangelist. When a decision was made, the negotiations with the locals had to follow with a down payment with lip shows. Finalizing for a lease was left for a later date, which would be officially done by the government. After my father had picked a site, the group moved on to the next village, Marabini. The Bible mission had already established contacts through that place. Meanwhile, the group looked around for a place to sleep. While they were waiting, the village people carried a huge pole decorated with bones of pigs and other animals and erected it on the village green. Long houses had been erected on both sides of the ceremonial green, which would be used for pig killing, dancing and feasting. These houses had been erected for a large number of guests who had already arrived. It was an elaborate ceremony, and it took time until the pole was eventually put in its place. My father did not comment on this ceremony, but we know from other sources how the 20-foot long pole was erected. Harland Kerr, took a series of pictures which can be seen on his website, showing how one end of the pole was fitted by manpower and then propped up with long poles until it eventually had reached the upright position. We are not sure if my father took pictures on this occasion. Sometimes he was careful not to interfere with local ceremonies, as his aim was to find a plot of land to place the evangelist. But he had already witnessed this ceremony a year before in Kawo. For this reason, I take the opportunity to explain the main philosophy of the cult. The Timbu cult was essentially a fertility cult. It was a ritual that was theoretically enacted every 4 years, with variations allowed, in order to maintain an ecological balance and fertility to humans, wild animals, pigs, and land. The center of the cult was a tall spirit house, Timbu Yapu, the sky house. The central pole, decorated with animal bones, which was about 20 feet long, was kept there until the feast was enacted, and was also called Timbu Yapu, and was only taken out when the feast was enacted. We owe a much deeper insight into the meaning of the cult to Dr. Harland Kerr, who wrote the language communication system of the Wiro grammar of culture, and thereby decoded the code of religion by a linguistic analysis. In order to understand the complex, we need to turn briefly to the Wiro myth of origin of language and death. The Supreme Being, Akolali, the creator and planter of all things, who lives at the zenith, the highest place in the universe, called the people of the Kewa, the Lai, and the Wiro to receive their language. The first two came and received their language with the words, "Live forever." The Wirus were stubborn and disobedient, and only came after being called 4 times. As a result, they were told they were doomed to die when they received their language. The cult and religious philosophy was based on this myth. The two central objects of the cult, the tall spirit house, Timbu Yapu, had a cone-shaped roof, which is called neck. This implies one would expect a head on top of the neck. However, as a head is missing, it must have been severed, thus showing that the Wiros were separated from their creator. The 20-foot-long pole, which was the central pole, was made of very hard wood. An axe would bounce back, showing it was tough and stubborn, just as the Wiros were stubborn when they received their language. The pole remained in the spirit house in total darkness. This means the Wiro lived in spiritual darkness. If a speck of light was detected in a roof, it had to be blocked immediately. In a 4-year cycle, the pole was taken out and erected perfectly straight up on the time of the equinox, the tropical zenith, which occurs 2 times a year, on the 21st of March and the 23rd of September, when the sun does not cast a shadow. Normally, the pole would be erected in September. The circular shape of the spirit house stands for the cycle of the year, without beginning and end, and points to the fact that the culture shared a circular rather than a linear worldview. Harland Kerr notes that it was remarkable for an illiterate society to lay down a hidden code to pass on the message of the meaning of the Timbu cult. He therefore preferred to call the Wiru a pre-literate rather than an illiterate society, since they had in fact laid down the principles of their cult in a hidden code of language. I consider this a very sympathetic appreciation of the complex meta-language in the hidden code. My father took pictures of the pole showing a cylinder-shaped object on the top of the pole which looked very much like a hat. This could imply that the hat was covering a head. The meaning of this may be interpreted that now, after 4 years of darkness, the pole with the hat stood in broad sunshine, pointing to the zenith, the highest point in the universe, where Akolali lived, the benevolent high spirit and creator of all things. In this moment, the people were as close to him as they ever could get. It is interesting to note that the red hat, also called aipo, was worn by men and initiated boys before the major pig killing to indicate the time of the killing in the Timbu ceremony was near at hand. The pig killing was a ritual of its own. Len Chake describes the pig killing ceremony in Yalibu area, which follows a very similar ritual to that of the Wiro. As his informant was the evangelist Korowa, we assume that his interpretation is reliable. The ritual was based on two parts. One addressed the spirit world and one addressed the community. The pigs were brought to the ceremonial green and tied there to stakes. After speeches were made praising the owner and the quality of the pigs, the men moved towards the pigs with clubs and proceeded to kill them. Chaka recalls, the air was soon filled with squealing and dying pigs. The dying animals were purposely left to squeal before the final blow in order to let the spirit world know that this sacrifice was meant for them. I believe we would be doing injustice to the Wiro were we to point our finger on the method of killing. They were only trying to do everything right according to the ritual. Its purpose was to appease the spirit world. After the celebration of the Timbu Cult, selected bones of the sacrificed pigs were attached to the central pole of the Timbu Yapu house. The spirit world could always be reminded of the sacrifice made to them, and each individual of the community could also see how many pigs had been sacrificed. Besides, the huge number of bones added prestige to the village that conducted the Timbu celebration. This brings us to another reason for pig killing. Beside the long houses stood another important object of the Timbu celebration, the food bed. This large platform was used to present the food to the guests. After the pigs had been slaughtered, the meat was displayed on a pole and then distributed and later cooked in a traditional mumu. After the spirit world had been satisfied, it was time for the community itself to receive the benefits of the ceremony. This ceremony had the purpose to even out debts, settle grievances and wrongs. The distribution of the pork was a means to strengthen the ties between individuals and clans. Each clan, each family, each individual was given food and the feasting began. It was a time to relax and to strengthen relationships. My father reports at that time of pig killing, the people consumed pork for days on end. It had to be consumed quickly before it went bad. Payments of the kina shells were also given to restore peace and mutual understanding among the people. Another central part of the Timbu cult was the shuffle dance. Dancers dressed in decorative attire, wearing a shell in front of them, danced in rows around the ceremonial green.
Before I continue with the story, I owe the listener an explanation. As you will have noticed, the ceremony of erecting the sacred pole had taken place in June and not at the time of equinox in September. My father reports that in all the villages of South Wiru, the people were doing the same at the same time. I have no conclusive answer on that question, but I offer two explanations. It is to be remembered that the two Kieps, Peter Barber and Brian O'Neill, had made a patrol to the South Wiru in November 1961. Geoffrey Clark states that the Wiro society was in disorder due to the powerful administration at that time. It is quite likely that the Wiros
therefore decided to get on with the Timbu celebration as soon as possible, and therefore set an earlier date than usual. Regardless of this, the pole would have been brought back into the spirit house after the equinox in September, as the Timbu feast lasted 4 months. In reality, this would have been the last full Timbu ritual to be conducted in that area, and it is quite likely that many realized that this would be the case. When the ceremony of erecting the sacred pole had come to a close, my father asked the village people if they had a place where they could sleep for the night. A man quickly took a broom, entered the house, swept the floor, and invited the guests inside. After they had settled down and started to talk, they came to the point and approached my father with the news that they did not want the Bible mission to come to their village. A delegation of the Bible mission had already arrived, but they had escorted the group to a hill far away and did not invite them into the village. My father attributed this to the mission approach. He and the evangelist had always said, "We have not come here to destroy or to tear down local traditions and beliefs, but we have come here to bring the good news of God." It was to be the people's own decision to leave traditional beliefs and spirit houses behind them when they had come to the conviction that the message of God was true and trustworthy. This stood in contrast to the practice of the Bible mission. The white missionaries themselves destroyed the cult houses of the people, and the people said the village people cried for fear and anguish when it was done. They also introduced the Sunday offerings in a church service much too early. They told the congregation, "Whoever does not pay will not come to God." This picture is an illustration from the publications of the Bible mission and shows the fate of pagans going to hell. The people could not understand why they should give back the money to the church which they had received from the missionary for the vegetables they had sold to him. All of these things had been spread by word of mouth in the Wiro area, and my father said this was a reason why they were welcomed with open arms wherever they arrived. This was particularly the case when they reached the village of Mamwane. Here the villagers were making preparations for the big pig feast. Hundreds of guests had come from all directions of the area and were getting ready for the big mother of pearl show, lip show. My father reports when we arrived, the headman of Mamwane, who would be called a paramount chief, ran towards me, grabbed my hand and guided me to the ceremonial green. There he shouted out in a loud singing voice, which was the traditional way of making an official proclamation. "We have been waiting for you. We want only your mission." Then the negotiations for the station of the evangelists were made. The group moved on from one place to the next. In a 6 days march, they nearly visited all of the major villages. Sometimes the group split up in order to move faster. They did not visit some distant villages, as the major aim was to cover the area as fast as possible. In 20 villages, the people had offered land to place an evangelist, and wherever they came, the people said, "Please, send us an evangelist as soon as possible. We have been waiting for such a long time." Although they had relatively good weather, the trails were terribly muddy. Reverend Döring was quoted to have said, he had seen many trails in New Guinea in his lifetime, but he had never seen such muddy trails as here. The patrol group had to stamp through deep mud that had been churned up by the feet of many visitors, and by now was well stirred up broth of mud
and at times reached up to the knees.
The missionaries were sad to hear reports of the locals who said, "Now we have been decimated, and only a few of us have survived. Most of our tribe has been killed by our enemies." My father commented that this was not all, since an epidemic had previously swept over the country and caused casualties to the population by at least 5%, if not more. But of course, there was much truth in the observation. Tribal feuds have always played a dominant role in the Wiro society and have left the people to live in a life of constant fear. A distinguished man once said, "In earlier times, we had to sleep with our spear in our hand. Now the gospel will bring us peace to our people." When my father returned, he stepped back to normal work on the station. It didn't take long, and he was sick. My mother gave him medication and nursed him back to health. In the meantime, she had to take care of the store and on top of her own workload. A few weeks later, a delegation from the coast came to discuss how many evangelists would be needed for the new area. There were representatives from Malalo, Buana, Madang and Tapin. My father was happy that he could escort the first 2 evangelists into the new area and place them there. In September 1962, 7 more evangelists arrived and were placed in their respective villages.
In October, the government started a new program, the Highlands Labour Scheme. They sent Wiros to the coast to work there as labourers on contract for 2 years. The program was intended to speed up development, giving the Wiros a chance to catch up with the rest of society and to generate income. As in most cases, such measures had many side effects. It not only speeded up the process of transforming society, but it was also the beginning of the so-called one-talk system in towns and cities. Young men of the same language group met and rivaled with other language groups, leading to gangs in the city.
The measure also called a heavy uproot in the home villages too. According to Jeffrey Clark, about 50 or 60% of the male workforce was involved. Marriages were disrupted, gardens not attended, putting pressure on those who were left behind to cope with the work. My father gave the workers stamped envelopes so they could communicate where they had landed, with letters of recommendation for their future employers. He also advised them to join a local Lutheran congregation, as the Lutheran Church had a wide network.
The second trip through the Wiro area and the placement of the evangelist would not have moved so smoothly had not the airstrip opened shortly before the trip. In March 1962, the airstrip of Pangia was opened after an official inspection. This was a huge occasion for the locals and a significant step in the development of the area. Up to this time, everything had to be carried from Yaribu to Tiripini, which was a trip of 7 hours with high expenses. Now the bush location Pangia was connected to the outside world with modern and fast transportation. It is worth remembering that the total construction was made by hand by the Wiros themselves and was carried out with digging sticks and barks for transporting the soil. The few spades provided by the government were by far not enough for all the many workers.
Indeed, times were now changing rapidly, and the irony of history is that every man with a digging stick was making change to happen faster as infrastructure continued to expand with every road construction. Hello, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this part 7. We are planning 15 parts of a YouTube series. If you are interested, I would be happy to invite you to look at part 8, a very interesting video on the Timbu Cult figures and the day that the spirit houses fell. Okay, See you then. Bye-bye.